Welcome back. It is time for Unit 10. As you can see by the very big name on the screen, we'll be talking about the Vietnam War today. So 10.1, we're going to be talking about the war itself. 10.2, we're going to talk about a lot of the stuff going on at home, especially with the sort of counterculture, anti-war movements that pop up. And 10.3 is going to be a lot of the political aspects of what's going on during that time, taking us through Nixon and Ford and Carter, as well as some stuff going on in the Middle East. So let's go ahead and get started with the war itself. So this image is a relatively famous photograph from the war. There's a lot of photographs, there's a lot of video from the Vietnam War. We'll talk about that as we keep going. But this is some U.S. Marines, getting ready to sort of attack what they think is a enemy position in the forest. A lot of jungle fighting, a lot of sort of guerrilla warfare style tactics being used against the U.S., and we'll get into a lot of those details as we go. Sorry. So how are things going for the president at the time, Lyndon Baines Johnson? Well, the fences around the White House were a little closer to the White House than they are today, and the anti-war protesters could get close enough that their chanting could be heard by LBJ here in the Oval Office. So I don't know if they're yelling at him right now when this picture's being taken, but he would be having meetings like this, and you would hear chants like 1, 2, 3, 4. What are we even fighting for? 5, 6, 7, 8. LBJ, it's you we hate. Or the perennial classic, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? So, not going great as far as LBJ's approval rating. So how did it all start? Why are we in Vietnam? Why are we getting involved in this conflict? Well, it's a complicated story. Our part sort of starts in 1954. We're not in Vietnam yet, not really. We're still dealing with Korea. Or we had just sort of finished up with Korea, actually, in 1954. And we were maintaining our military presence in South Korea. And President Eisenhower coins the term Domino Theory. And the Domino Theory says that if one country, like Korea or Vietnam, falls to communism, then all of the other countries in Southeast Asia would fall too. So here you have the political cartoon showing this. Russia, 1917, the Communist Revolution in Russia. The Eastern Europe getting taken over by Russia and becoming the Soviet Union after World War II, 1945. China's Communist Revolution in 1949, North Vietnam's Communist Revolution in 1954. The worry is that South Vietnam is next, and then if that falls, it's going to hit Laos and Cambodia and Thailand, and then the rest of the world. And so what Eisenhower thought we needed to do, and there's Ike right there pushing back against this sort of communist tide. And there's JFK and LBJ, doing their part. Well, JFK more than LBJ, I guess. And if you're looking at that going, wait. So you're saying the U.S. government is going to do its very best to stop a domino from falling, which would spread communism to the other dominoes. Isn't that kind of like the containment policy thing we learned about last unit with Korea and all that stuff? And isn't the containment policy basically the same thing as this domino theory? Yes. There's no but there. They're basically the same thing. They have slightly different names. But it's the same idea, right? So when I said last time around, when I said that, containment policy is going to be the foreign policy of the U.S. for the next few decades, we're still right here in the middle of it. We call it the domino theory now, but it's still basically containment policy. And a real quick Texas connection to this situation, other than LBJ being from Texas. Vietnam, a lot of folks from Vietnam came and immigrated to America and settled in Texas. If you were to rank the languages spoken in the state of Texas, English, unsurprisingly, is going to be number one. I imagine if I tell you English is the most common language spoken in Texas, you'd probably be able to correctly answer that Spanish is the second most commonly spoken language in the state of Texas. But the third most, number three, if we list how many people speak each of these languages, number one, English, number two, Spanish, number three, a little bit further down, but still number three, is Vietnamese. A whole lot of Vietnamese immigrants in Texas. A lot of Vietnamese American communities, a lot of Vietnamese immigrants that just moved into, non-majority Vietnamese neighborhoods. So just a whole lot of folks that live in this country and live in Texas from Vietnam. So there's a big Texas connection to Vietnam. Also, North Texas, Laos. I don't know if you've driven around North Texas recently, but there are quite a few Buddhist temples in North Texas, Fort Worth, Arlington, Saginaw, around. And a lot, not all of them, but a lot of them are, communities that were built on immigrants coming from Laos, and they, sort of lived in similar neighborhoods, and they came up and they've had kids, and there's multiple generations that have, been in America now. And a lot of that community is Buddhist, and they have their temples. And so if you've been driving around and seen a really big Buddhist temple and wondered, what the heck? Well, probably one of those Laotian communities that lives in this area. And if you live in one of those communities and you're like, yeah, I know, well, then you already know. But there's a big Texas connection in this whole thing, which we'll get into a little bit, but that's not really going to be on the STAR test, so we're going to focus on other things. But that's domino theory, right? So President LBJ before and after the war. So before the war, LBJ is big on the war on poverty, the Great Society, his re-election campaign in '64. Hey, all the way with LBJ. People are psyched. People like this guy. And after the war, LBJ doesn't finish out the war. That'll happen under Nixon. But close to 60,000 Americans are dead in the war. And during LBJ's presidency, he ends up spending about 18 times the amount of money on the Vietnam War than his war on poverty with Medicare and Medicaid and food stamps and all the rest of those programs we talked about last unit. So, not what LBJ wanted to be remembered for, but it's probably what he's going to be remembered for, So this map, we're going to come back to this map a few times. It's pretty basic, but it shows what we need to see. This is the basic map of the war. We have in red Vietnam there on the east coast of this peninsula. North Vietnam, obviously in the north, South Vietnam in the south. The white line, the demilitarized zone between the two of them, was sort of that dividing line for the few years they weren't at war. And then you have China up north with Chairman Mao, and you have Ho Chi Minh pictured there in North Vietnam. And all of the things that have the little slant lines through them, those were part of French Indochina from the late 1800s through the 1950s. So speaking of Vietnam and China and France, let's do a brief history of invasions in Vietnam. And by brief history, I mean, let's start about 2,000 years ago. So about 200 BC, Roman Empire's doing its thing. Caesar and Cleopatra and stuff weren't around quite yet, but so it's the Roman Republic, really, is doing its thing. China wants access to Vietnam's natural resources. It has incredibly good soil for growing rice. And if you're China and you have a whole lot of people you need to feed, Vietnam looks like a pretty tempting spot. And you'll remember on the map, it's a coastal region. Having access to water is a big deal in human history, right? Access to food, access to transportation, access to trade. So you definitely want coastlines if you're wanting to be a big, powerful country at pretty much any point in human history. You want access to water. And so for about 1,000 years, now there's not one war that went on for 1,000 years, but there were many invasions of Vietnam that happened, and a lot of resistance movements, a lot of rebellions, a lot of revolutions. You could take obviously it's a 1,000-year time period. You could easily take an entire college course over that and not learn everything you need to know. So what you need to know here, though, is that the Vietnamese people got really good at using what we call today guerrilla warfare tactics. Hiding, ambushing, laying traps. This is a North Vietnamese soldier kind of down in a sort of hiding in like a hole or a ditch, and the plan is to pop up and shoot somebody without them seeing him and then escaping. Very common tactic used throughout. Obviously not with guns 2,000 years ago, but similar situations. So in 1883, France steps in. They need more colonies, right? This is not quite 20 years after the American Civil War. I'll give you a rough time frame. And France takes over what is today Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. They call it French Indochina because China's on one side of that territory and India's on the other side of that territory. So French Indochina. And they kind of, to keep control, now there's revolts and rebellions and whatnot, but France pretty much keeps control until World War II breaks out, when Japan comes by to take over. And they conquer what is then French Indochina for the Japanese sphere of influence, that area that they wanted to branch out and become an empire and do all the big things the European empires were doing. So they took away some of France's colonies because, European empires did that to each other all the time. And obviously, at the end of World War II, Japan is on the losing side of it. The U.S. and France are on the winning side of it. So after World War II, France retakes Indochina. Now, you might think, well, yeah, because Japan took it away from France. Japan loses the war. France can have it back. And maybe, I don't know, international law is what it is. But at the end of World War II, a lot of empires gave up a lot of their colonies. Not all of them, but England gave up a bunch of their colonies. The U.S. gave up the Philippines, right? The Philippines get their independence at this time. And after the U.S. helps free Cambodia, Laos, and, Vietnam from Japan, they think they're going to be free as well. They're finally going to have their independence back. They can rule themselves. They can, be their own independent nation. And the U.S. goes, no, actually, France gets to have you back. And because of the Domino Theory, we back France's play, because we know France won't go communist. We're not so sure about the Vietnamese, especially them being so close to China. So, Ho Chi Minh versus France. This is a picture of Ho Chi Minh. He was the leader of the North Vietnamese. And in 1945, when Vietnam is told, no, France is going to retake over, Ho Chi Minh and his group of Vietnamese people, his political party basically, they didn't officially have political parties, but his political backers, they declare independence from France. And they basically call up the U.S. and say, hey, we want to be a democracy. We want to have a constitution. Just like you, will you help us put together a constitution? Will you help us put together a form of government? And the U.S. says no, because we're backing France's play. And so we end up we don't end up in this war, right? This is France versus Vietnam. But the U.S. is spending money and supplies. And over the next few years, we have to send more and more money and supplies in. Now, thankfully, 1954, we end up with a conference in Geneva, so sort of a peace talk, some peace treaties get put together. And basically what it comes down to is we have an independent communist North Korea, which is backed by China. North Vietnam. Both North Korea and North Vietnam are communist countries backed by China. A little bit of a different separation geographically, but similar situations. So North Vietnam is a independent communist country backed by China, and South Vietnam becomes a sort of democratic-ish. I mean, there's elections and there's voting, but like a lot of corruption, a lot of the elections aren't exactly free and fair. A little bit more of a dictatorship than a democracy. But the U.S. backs them because they're not communists, and we don't want this domino to fall. We want to continue our containment policy. So the Vietnam War, it says begins here, but it kind of starts back up. So in 1954, the French military remained in South Vietnam to protect it from the communist North. The war keeps going on. The U.S. is footing more and more of the bill. We're sending more money and more guns and more explosives and ammunition and all that stuff to France. And by 1960, we don't have like a bunch of troops there or anything, but we have like a whole lot of money invested in this. In 1960, France decides, you know what, we're out. It's not worth it. We're done. And America's kind of left there holding the bag, like, well, what do we do now? And France is like, I don't know, but we're out. So if we're going to kind of keep our domino theory intact, we have to step in and help out. So we step in and we sort of like help out the president of South Vietnam, President Diem. And he's not, 1960, he's not a very effective leader as far as the U.S. is concerned. We weren't too concerned about what the Vietnamese thought. We were concerned about what we thought. And we didn't think he was doing a good enough job fending off North Vietnam. And so when there's a sort of military-backed coup that happens that ends up with the assassination of President Diem, it's entirely possible, very probable. Basically, we did it. We backed the coup. We backed the new people in charge because we weren't very happy with President Diem. And the very next year, the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurs. Now, this boat here, the USS Maddox, is attacked by North Vietnamese forces in the Gulf of Tonkin. We saw that on the map a minute ago, but right there, up there in the middle, Gulf of Tonkin, right up there by North Vietnam and China. So the U.S. claims that the U.S. Maddox gets attacked by some Vietnamese ships. And maybe that happened, and maybe that didn't. The North Vietnamese say they never attacked the Maddox. They never attacked any U.S. ships. And we don't have a ton of evidence. Like these days, we'd have obvious video evidence of everything that happens, and it'd be super easy to verify it. Back then, not so much. So this is one of those historical we said, they said kind of things. But the official U.S. the official U.S. Version of the story is we get attacked, we fight back, and Congress passes what they call the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. And the Tonkin Gulf Resolution is not a declaration of war. We do not declare war. But Congress does authorize the use of military force in Vietnam so the president can send in the military to fight North Vietnam because they attacked us. But it's not a war because we didn't declare war. So officially it's not a war. It is a war, it's just not. Officially the last war we declared and fought was World War II. But since then we've had the Korean War, we've had the Vietnam War, we've had the Gulf War, and yet those are all police actions because of an authorization of the use of military force. AUMF is what those are officially referred to today. And so we start this war. We get it going. We get it started. Operation Rolling Thunder, 1965 to 1968. And this is basically the name given to the Air Force bombing the heck out of the North Vietnamese forces and the South Vietnamese communist revolutionaries, the Viet Cong. And we drop enough bombs, and we'll talk about the other weapons in a minute, but explosives that are equivalent to 800 tons of TNT. Not over the course of those 3 years total, every single day of those 3 years. Now, most of you that are watching this in U.S. history class are in the 11th grade, if you're a U.S. history student in Texas. So if you think back to 3 years ago, that was what, 8th grade? Probably. So if you kind of think back to what was going on during your 8th grade year, and you think about all of the time in between there and today, that's roughly 3 years. Every single day of those 3 years, the U.S. would have dropped 800 tons of explosives equivalent to TNT. Every single one of those days. That day you had to go to the dentist. The day you did, you had went to the football game, the homecoming. Every one of those homecoming games. That day, 800 tons of TNT. That day that you had to really study for that test that you were afraid of, 800 tons of TNT. The day that that half day where you got to go hang out with your friends afterward, it was a pretty good day. 800 tons of TNT dropped that day too, right? So every single one of those days, that's what we did for 3 years. Now these 3 years were not, 20 into 2010s. This was 1965 to 1968. It is a massive bombing campaign. More explosives dropped than in the entirety of World War II. Now, a few of the special weapons we used this time were napalm, Agent Orange, and cluster bombs. Napalm, those were made up of fire bombs to clear forests. Agent Orange was a pesticide to try and destroy all of the forests that the Vietnamese forces were hiding in, and cluster bombs that would just explode and release shrapnel. Show you a few pictures of these. I forgot I had the transitions on those. How fun. Okay. Not the smoothest transitions, my bad. So you have these American planes spraying Agent Orange. It just looks like crop dusters, because they are. Cluster bombs, so those are bombs with a whole bunch of little bombs inside of them that blow shrapnel everywhere. And then napalm, highly explosive, highly flammable, and it sticks, right? It's like a jelly sort of substance, and it sticks and it burns. Real bad stuff. We'll take a look at some of the effects that all of this stuff had on Vietnam and the Vietnamese people. Now, how did the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese forces fight back? Well, guerrilla warfare, like they'd done for 1,000 years against China and a few decades against France already. So by 1967, most communist fighters in the South were actually from South Vietnam instead of North Vietnamese people coming down and fighting. I mean, there were certainly North Vietnamese troops fighting in this war, but by this point, most of this is a civil war in South Vietnam. You have the South Vietnamese governmental forces backed by the U.S., and you have South Vietnamese communist revolutionaries, the Viet Cong. So guerrilla warfare is the style they use. So here on this little chart we can see you might have one building up in the forest, a small little meeting room building, and underneath all of this stuff you would have little firing holes where you would have, a roof on it that would look like normal jungle flooring, and then, you could pop out and fire a gun or throw a grenade or shoot a rocket, and then pop back down and hide before the U.S. could come find you. You had a trap door that you could get down into the into the bigger tunnel system. You'd have different hallways through it. You'd have little air holes coming down to make sure fresh air was able to get in. You had a medical room. You had blast deflection walls. So if you just dug straight down and had a big room, well, if they could find out your hole, they would just toss a grenade in and then everybody dies. But if you sort of dig in these little, sort of a jagged way, then the explosion is going to, not necessarily go everywhere and kill everybody. So it's these guys know what they're doing, right? These people aren't stupid. They don't have the same kind of technology the U.S. has, but that doesn't mean they're not smart. And you might think, well, this is horrifying. Well, yeah, war is hell. And this is the special kind of hell of the Vietnam War. But you had water wells you could dig straight down to. You had different meeting rooms. You had storage rooms for food and weapons. So you never had to like pop up into the jungle more than get your head up there and get your gun out there and shoot a few times. You could fight your whole war from down in here. And then you would have different spike traps and pit traps, like in this one they call it a Punchy stake trap, and that's from it's a common type of trap, the Punchy stake trap. That's specifically from a region in India would put together ones like that. So you'd see one tiny little building, and all around that would be a huge tunnel system where you might get fired on from any angle, from any place, at any time. So, pretty rough. So the U.S. starts what they call search and destroy missions. Now, obviously, they're trying to find these things and destroy them, but they also knew that a lot of these people had to go home at some point to a village. So they would destroy entire villages. They would get there, they would find all of the Vietnamese people that they were pretty sure were not members of the Viet Cong, and they would basically send them on to the next village, and then they would just burn down the entire village. Burn all the farms, burn all the buildings, just burn everything. Because if you don't give them a place to hide, they can't hide, was the idea. And as the war went on, the official U.S. policy was that any Vietnamese person that was killed by the U.S. was a member of the Viet Cong, so technically we didn't kill any innocent civilians. And if you're like, wow, that's super lucky that every single bullet we fired and every single one of those bombs we dropped didn't kill just a civilian person who wasn't involved in the war. Well, officially. Obviously it happened a lot, but officially it didn't. So the war can't last forever, and it doesn't. This here is sort of the beginning of the end. So U.S. morale is not doing so great. This is a war of attrition, right? This is not a war of territory, right? There's not like, this isn't World War I where we're trying to conquer territories and we have these trenches and we battle the Germans and we take their territory and we keep pushing them back further and we get pushed back. Like, it's not a war of territory. It is a war of attrition, and you win a war of attrition by killing more of them than they can kill of you. It's just a body count. And that's really rough on our soldiers, obviously. Also, the media is one of the reasons why the U.S. is not a huge, the people of the U.S. are not a huge fan of this war, because we're getting pictures and videos of injured and dead American troops, injured and dead Vietnamese people, every single night on the news. And the sort of real beginning of the end, sort of that nail in the coffin of that first nail in the coffin of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam is the Tet Offensive. This happens, and this is what this map shows. This happens January 31st, 1968. The Viet Cong attack about 150 U.S. military targets, military bases, military outposts, that kind of a thing. And that was, now they didn't like conquer all of those, they didn't win all of those fights, they didn't completely destroy the U.S. military that day or anything like that. But for years now, the U.S. had been saying, the U.S. government had been telling the people of the U.S., the citizens of the U.S., this war's almost over. We've got them on the ropes. We just got to finish them off. Give us a little bit more time. We're good. And like, maybe you weren't sure if you believed them or not. Maybe you believed him. Maybe you weren't sure. But after the Tet Offensive, clearly this has been a lie. Clearly an enemy that can attack 150 of our military institutions, military bases, military targets in a day. They're not almost done. They're in this for the long haul. They're ready to fight as long and hard as they need to. So what this does is it settles in what we call a credibility gap. The fact that here's what the government is telling us, and it used to be here's what the government is telling us, here's what we believe. And now it's here's what the government's telling us, and here's what we believe. We don't believe it, the government anymore. And the U.S. has never been super trusting of our government, but like, this is different, you know? So we're going to take a brief dip into politics. We'll talk about this more. Oops. Class isn't over yet. The teacher dismisses the class, not the bell. Anyway, so we'll get into the actual politics of this a bit more after spring break, but real quick, this is important to the Vietnam War. Election of 1968, you can tell Richard Nixon wins by a lot. Hubert Humphrey, the Democrat, not super popular. And even George Wallace, the American independent, the segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever guy, he takes a few states. So that's the end result of the election. But you don't see LBJ's name on there. He was legally allowed to run again. I know he had taken over part of President Kennedy's term, and then he got elected in 1964 for his own 4-year term. But he took over Kennedy's term right at the end. And the 22nd Amendment, that goes into all the details on this, says that, normally you get 2 terms in 8 years. But if you were the vice president and you got moved up to being president, more than halfway into that president's term, that one doesn't count. So technically, you could be president for almost 10 years. And LBJ could have been. But he decides not to run. 2 reasons. One, he is super unpopular in the country because of the Vietnam War. His approval rating is at about 35%, which is almost the lowest a president has ever been. I think one president was lower than him. It might have been Andrew Johnson. Anyway, doesn't matter. He was incredibly unpopular, and he was pretty sure he was going to lose the election, so he's just not even going to bother trying. And he had also commissioned a study. His family had a bunch of health issues. Neither of his parents had lived to be very old. I mean, they lived to be in their 60s or whatever, but they didn't live to be 70, 80, 90 years old. And, LBJ was already in his 60s. So he commissions a study, gets a whole bunch of doctors together to go over his health, to go over his health records, to take, tests and look at everything. And they come back and tell him, like, look, man, you don't have cancer, you don't have some crazy disease right now, but, based on everything we know, you're probably going to die in the next 3 or 4 years. So he's like, well, I don't want the last 3 or 4 years of my life to be the most unpopular president ever. Even if I do win, I'm just going to go home and enjoy the time I have left. And his doctors were right. He ends up dying about 4 years later. So he would not have finished out his next presidential term. He would not have. So Robert F. Kennedy's name also isn't up there in the 1968 election results because this is when he gets assassinated. And Richard Nixon runs on law and order at home. We will talk about that after spring break. And peace with honor with Vietnam. And we'll talk about that now. And Richard Nixon wins. He wins the election of 1968. He's also going to win the election of 1972. Spoiler alert, we'll talk about it. So what did he mean by peace with honor? Well, he was going to set up a South Vietnamese government that could basically hold off North Vietnam long enough for the U.S. to declare victory and peace out. And then they'd hold on for a little while, and then who knows what would happen, but we could have left. We could have had a peace treaty going. We could have honorably left the peninsula. And it's not like we lost. It's not like we got kicked out. Everyone well played. Everyone shake hands, good game. We left. And then things went bad, and that's not our fault. So the process of doing that is what was called Vietnamization. And basically all that was the U.S. troops would slowly pull out over the course of a few years, and they would let the South Vietnam troops take over. And that was what we did. Now, North Vietnam is getting closer and closer to when Richard Nixon wants his peace with honor. He wants to pull America out of this situation. And North Vietnam's not cooperating. They're not coming to the table. They're not doing what they need to do. So he orders some really big bombing runs on Cambodia. which is next door. Now, technically, officially, it was to attack hidden North Vietnamese troops that were in Cambodia. But like unofficially, Nixon was showing his hand. He was showing Ho Chi Minh that he would fight this war like a madman. He'll just bomb anybody. He'll do whatever he needs to do. And like obviously it doesn't scare off the North Vietnamese and they declare peace and we never have to worry about him again. But it does sort of show North Vietnam like, all right, let's give Nixon his peace with honor, right? So 1973, we have a ceasefire, and the U.S. leaves South Vietnam with our own government. They have their own government, they have their own military set up, and North Vietnam is allowed to remain as an independent communist nation. Now, 1975, 2 years later, North Vietnam invades South Vietnam and quickly conquers the capital, Saigon. This is not the last helicopter out of Saigon, but this is one of the last helicopters out of Saigon. There were still some U.S. military presence, and there were a lot of South Vietnamese people who backed the U.S. and were worried if the North ever came down to conquer it, they would all be, murdered or put in camps or arrested or whatever. So a lot of them were able to escape. As you can see, even babies were on the flight. It's a whole thing. A very famous incident. And if we were doing an entire course on the Vietnam War, we would spend a whole lot of time on it. But that's the time we have. So if all this stuff, if we always get to the interesting part and then we have to keep moving on, I'm not saying you got to go become a history major and go to college and spend all that money just to find out what happened next. You can do a lot of independent research without being a history major. But if you are going to go to college, and you do need to take some elective courses for whatever it is you're planning on doing, you could take some history elective courses, learn more about the things you're interested in. Or if you're not going to go to college, there's books, there's documentaries, there's YouTube videos, there's all kinds of stuff out there that can, get you the rest of these stories. And honestly, it's entirely possible members of your family are involved in this stuff. Some of them might still be alive, or people that knew them might still be alive. So, check in with your family. Maybe they've got some stories. So, the aftermath of the war. So, the communists, if you put together the North Vietnam troops and the South Vietnamese communists, the Viet Cong, if you put those casualties together, there's probably around 1 million dead people in their group. Casualties among South Vietnamese soldiers and civilians ended up being about 700,000 dead. And like I mentioned earlier, U.S. casualties, about 58,000 dead. And a few thousand POWs, right? If you've seen this flag being flown, I've seen it on plenty of flagpoles in the state of Texas. Certainly seen stickers on the back of cars and trucks. And it is a POW, prisoner of war, MIA, missing in action. So there's a lot of people that never came back from Vietnam, and we don't know if they died or if they were in prison. We got some of them back with prisoner exchanges. We found some of their remains. There's people that go out and look for what's left of dead bodies and dog tags and stuff. So over the years we have recovered some of the bodies, some of the prisoners, but there's still a lot of people that never made it back, and we don't really know what happened to them. And when the soldiers did get back, the ones that did come home and did survive through this, there wasn't a big parade. There was no big, remember with World War II, that Navy sailor popping off and just grabbing the first nurse he could, and a kid we won, and parades, and everyone was happy. Nothing like that for the Vietnam soldiers. There's actually anti-war protesters showed up, protesting against the soldiers, calling them baby killers. And freedom of speech and all, I get it, but if you weren't a big fan of the Vietnam War, I don't think it was the soldiers' fault. I don't know if I'd blame them first, Maybe blame the people that made the decisions. But one of the people that did earn the Medal of Honor, he's obviously he was not the only person that won the Medal of Honor in Vietnam, but the Texas Education Agency, the State Board of Education, put him on our list of teaks, so we're going to talk briefly about him. I'd highly recommend on your own copy of these notes clicking on the link there to read his full story. But Roy Benavidez was one of the Medal of Honor recipients in Vietnam. He was a soldier in the U.S. Army. And the specific incident... I dismissed the class, not the bell. Better joke the first time, but got to do the callback. He leads a recovery mission. The specific incident he wins the Medal of Honor for. He leads a recovery mission. There were U.S. troops pinned down by enemy fire. Helicopters had tried to get in to rescue them and could not. So he sort of leads the second recovery mission to get those soldiers. And he ends up being able to land his helicopter. Well, he's not the pilot, but his helicopter's able to land. He gets out and is able to run over to the group of soldiers and start firing back and start sort of get them all going, getting them water, getting them more ammo to basically fight off the Vietnamese soldiers that are coming in. And he gets shot a bunch of times. He gets shot at least 3 or 4 times during this whole thing, and he's able to make it back and forth from the helicopter multiple times, getting living but wounded soldiers back to the helicopter, getting dead bodies back to the helicopter, and making sure any classified information is destroyed or recovered before he gets back in the helicopter. And he survived that whole incident, and I think he finally passed away in like 1998. So I was alive when he was alive. I was in high school at the time, but obviously I didn't know him. I didn't know that's when he passed away, but kind of looking back to my own calendar, my own.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Anyway, read the full story there. It's pretty wild. All right, take 2 on this slide. Sorry for the weird little cut there. I messed up. I had to go back and do it again. So, the Vietnam War also damaged the U.S. reputation. We already talked about how it damaged it at home with the credibility gap, right? Americans are feeling lied to by our government. And that's, obviously the U.S. American people haven't always trusted our government all the time, and honestly, fair. But this is different. This is a pretty direct lie that we see that the U.S. government had done, and we'll talk about that more with the Pentagon Papers later this week. Because it wasn't just like, the U.S. government was wrong about how hard the war was going to be. Like, no, the U.S. government was just straight lying to us, and they knew it, and they were... It's a whole thing. We'll get to it. And then the international community, other countries are not a fan of what we've done. They think that we are sort of the aggressor here, that we have... that we've completely... just came in and kicked people around, and we're the big bad guys with the giant weapons, and we're just attacking these people that have no real way of defending themselves against us. And that's not exactly how it went down, but that's how other people see this, including these Austrians right here. This is a march in Austria, 1968, for freedom, and I don't know actual language, but Frieden is freedom. And then gegen den Krieg der USA in Vietnam would be basically stop the war, stop the war between the USA and Vietnam, get the USA out of there, something like that. Anyway, so that's kind of how the international community sees this. So it's not a good look for the U.S., either at home or abroad. And in 1982, the year I was born, the Vietnam War Memorial is constructed. It is a black granite wall with the names of all of the U.S. soldiers who died in the war. Currently, there's a little over 58,000 names on there. There is room at the end for, people that we find when we find bodies, when we find remains, when we can verify that someone else died during the war. There's some room left to add their names if we need to. There have been names added since 1982 as we found remains and gotten confirmed reports that some of these soldiers that were missing did die. This is in Washington, D.C. You can see the Washington Monument sort of right on the other side. If you've been to D.C., you've probably been to visit this. We did. Went there on a school trip, and we went there, and it's big, and just the amount of names it's something else. It's really something else. So just want to remember when we talk about wars like this, like, yes, it's interesting to see the technology, the guns, the planes, the tanks, the tactics, but like, we can't forget the human cost here, right? 1 million Vietnamese Vietnamese communists, 700,000 South Vietnamese people, almost 60,000 American troops, right? And that's the low end of the estimations, right? We don't actually know how many people died. We don't have an accurate count. We have our best guesses, and they're educated guesses, and they're only guesses, right? We'll never know how many people died in this war. And so I just want to leave with one last image of the Vietnam War Memorial, and then we'll call it a day, and we'll see you next time. Yeah, see you next time.